My name is Ruben Tran, and I was desperate, not the kind of desperate where you skip a meal or two. I mean the kind where you're standing outside a glass tower in the rain, holding a borrowed umbrella that flips inside out in the wind, wearing a uniform that isn't yours, and telling yourself that this is fine. Everything is fine. You are absolutely not about to cry in front of a building full of strangers. The uniform was my cousin Lily's fault. She worked as a domestic staff coordinator for high-end residential placements, and when I'd called her at 2 in the morning 3 weeks ago, voice cracking, explaining that my landlord had raised my rent by 40% and my part-time job at the bookshop had just gone under, she'd listened patiently. Then she'd said, "I have something. It's a bit unusual. But the pay is extraordinary." I should have asked more questions. The job posting was for a live-in household assistant at the Meridian penthouse, which occupied the entire top floor of the Callaway Tower. The employer was listed simply as Keith Mason, with a note that read, "Previous applicants need not reapply." Position requires discretion, adaptability, and a high tolerance for difficult personalities. That last part should have been a red flag the size of a building. The uniform is mandatory, Lily had told me over the phone, her voice careful in that way it gets when she's about to say something she knows I won't like. It's a formal household. He has a specific standard. What kind of uniform? A pause. A traditional service uniform, another pause. Longer. Lily, it's a maid uniform, Ruben. But it's very tasteful. High quality. There are trousers instead of a skirt, so, I had hung up. Then I'd called back 10 minutes later, because the rent was due in 4 days and I had exactly enough in my bank account to cover 2 of them, so here I was. Standing in the rain outside Callaway Tower, wearing a crisp black and white service uniform with a small embroidered crest on the chest pocket, my dark hair damp at the edges despite the broken umbrella. The trousers fit well, I had to admit. The white collared shirt beneath the fitted black vest was pressed immaculately. I had done my best to look professional, not ridiculous, and I was approximately 40% succeeding. I was an omega. That was the other thing. That was, as it turned out, the main thing. The world had shifted about 2 generations back. The biological dynamics that had once been thought of as myth or metaphor had proven stubbornly, biologically real. Alphas, betas, omegas, not a rigid hierarchy anymore. The social reformists had fought hard for that, but still present. Still something you carried in your blood and your scent and the way your body occasionally betrayed you at the absolute worst possible moments. I presented as Omega at 16. A late bloomer, the doctors said. It explained a lot about me, the way I'd always been quietly sensitive to the moods of rooms, the way strong alpha presence made something in my chest go tight, the way I could walk into a building and know immediately whether the person in charge was stressed or calm or angry just by something in the air. It also explained why finding stable employment had been a slow, grinding exercise in navigating other people's assumptions. I was 23. I had a degree in hospitality management. I was good at my job, organized, attentive, efficient, invisible when I needed to be. But the moment any employer caught my designation on the paperwork, something shifted. They either became overly cautious, tiptoeing around me like I was made of glass, or they became something worse. Lily had assured me that Kate Mason was designation neutral in hiring. I chose to believe her. I had no other options. I pushed through the glass doors. The lobby was the kind of space that whispers money so quietly it becomes a roar. Polished stone floors the color of dark honey. Soft lighting that made everyone look like they were in a film. A reception desk staffed by a beta woman with precise posture and a headset, who looked at me as I approached and let her gaze travel, very briefly but very completely, down my uniform and back up. Ruben Tran. I said, before she could say anything. I have an interview appointment. 10:30. For the Meridian position, she checked her screen. Something about her expression shifted, not unkind, but careful. Of course. You're the 5th candidate today. She handed me a badge. 42nd floor. Someone will meet you, 5th candidate today. I took the badge and tried not to think about that. the elevator was glass on one side, and as it rose I watched the lobby shrink below me, the city spreading out in gray and rain behind it. I took a slow breath. Pressed down the low hum of anxiety that lived just below my ribs. You're good at this, I told myself. You're qualified. You're wearing a ridiculous uniform but you're qualified. The elevator opened onto a small anteroom. White walls. 2 chairs. A narrow table with a single orchid on it. And a woman standing with a tablet who introduced herself as Ms. Cho, executive assistant to Mr. Mason. She was a beta, calm and efficient, and she looked at me the way people look at things they're assessing rather than judging. I appreciated that. Before we proceed, she said, I need to inform you that Mr. Mason has declined all 4 candidates interviewed this morning. His requirements are specific. She paused. He is an alpha. A strong one. Some candidates found the environment uncomfortable. I want to be transparent with you. I appreciate that, I said. I'm comfortable. I wasn't sure that was true, but I'd said it, so now I had to be. She nodded and gestured for me to follow her. The penthouse door was heavy. That was the first thing I noticed. Not in a dramatic way, it just swung open with the kind of weight that speaks to quality, to permanence, to someone who built their spaces to keep the world out very effectively. The interior was vast and cold. Not temperature cold, the air was perfectly climate controlled, but aesthetically, emotionally cold. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides. Furniture in charcoal and slate and deep navy. A kitchen that looked like it had never been used for anything as human as cooking a meal and enjoying it. Every surface immaculate. Every angle precise. It was beautiful the way a mathematics problem is beautiful. Correct. Impressive. Utterly without warmth, Miss Cho led me through the main living space toward a study at the far end, and I was about halfway across the room when I felt it, alpha presence. Strong. The kind that doesn't announce itself with noise or display, the kind that simply is, the way gravity is, a pressure that you suddenly become aware your body has already been responding to for several seconds before your brain catches up. I had been in the presence of alphas before. I had worked for alphas before. I knew how to manage my responses, the slight instinct to defer. The awareness of mood, the low current of biological recognition that ran beneath conscious thought like a river under ice. I had learned, carefully and deliberately, not to let any of it show, but this was different. Stronger. Like the difference between standing near a fireplace and standing near a furnace, I kept walking. I kept my spine straight and my expression neutral. Miss Cho knocked on the study door and opened it. Mr. Mason. Your 5 o'clock, your 10:30 appointment is here, send them in. His voice was low. Not loud. Not performative. Just, present, the way a thunderstorm is present before it arrives. In the drop of pressure in the air, I stepped into the study. Kenneth Mason was not what I expected. I don't know what I expected, exactly. Something more, performed. More visibly powerful. The kind of alpha who wears their dominance like a coat, loud, obvious, making sure you see it. He was sitting behind a desk that was aggressively tidy, reading something on a slim tablet. He didn't look up immediately. Late 20s, I guessed, though there was something in his face that made him seem both older and younger than any age I could pin to him. Dark hair, pushed back from his face in a way that was either very deliberate or completely absent-minded, I couldn't tell. Sharp jaw. Excellent bone structure, if you were the sort of person who noticed bone structure. Which I absolutely was not. He was dressed in a dark charcoal suit. No tie. The top button of his shirt open. It should have made him look casual. It didn't. He looked up, his eyes were the color of deep water. The kind of green-gray that changes depending on the light. And they landed on me with a focus that was immediate. Complete. Like I had walked into the beam of a very precise light source, I watched something move across his face. Too fast to read. Then it was gone, replaced by the kind of controlled neutrality that I suspected was his default expression. Ruben Tran, he said. Not a question, yes. Good morning, Mr. Mason. A pause. His gaze moved, just slightly. Taking in the uniform. I held very still. I was not going to apologize for the uniform. It was his uniform. It was his requirement. Sit down. Saturday, he set the tablet down. Folded his hands on the desk. And looked at me with that precise, unreadable focus for a moment that lasted approximately 3 centuries. You're an Omega, he said. Yes. I kept my voice even. Is that a problem? Another pause. No. It's an observation. Then I'd prefer we move on to my qualifications. Something shifted in his expression. The faintest thing. Not quite amusement. Not quite surprise. Something between the two that he clearly had no intention of letting develop into either. All right. He said. Tell me about your qualifications. I told him. I had rehearsed it, and I delivered it cleanly, my degree, my 3 years of hospitality work, my experience managing household logistics for a short-term residential client in my 2nd year, my organizational systems, my cooking competency, my discretion regarding private employer matters. He listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions. They were sharp, specific questions, not generic interview questions but the kind that told you the person asking them had been doing this long enough to know exactly what evasive answers sounded like. I answered all 3 directly. When I finished, he looked at me for a moment. The previous 4 candidates, he said. Do you want to know why I declined them? I considered this. Only if it's relevant to my application. It is. He leaned back slightly in his chair. It was the first movement he'd made that wasn't completely controlled. The first candidate couldn't maintain eye contact. The second apologized for existing approximately 11 times in 40 minutes. The third deferred to every statement I made, including 2 that were factually incorrect, which I stated deliberately. The fourth scented strongly of anxiety within the first 10 minutes and had to leave. I processed this. And what are you looking for instead? Someone who can function in my presence without either dissolving or performing. His voice was flat, factual. I am apparently difficult to be around. I am aware of this. I am not interested in addressing it or apologizing for it. I need someone who can do their job in my house without being constantly affected. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard a prospective employer say in an interview, and I wasn't sure if I found it refreshing or alarming. I'm not here to perform, I said. And I'm not going to dissolve. He looked at me again with that measuring gaze. You've been in this room for 22 minutes. Most Omegas, most people, begin showing visible stress markers around the 10-minute mark, I noticed. I paused. I've been managing my responses since I walked in. A beat. Managing them or suppressing them? I blinked. That was a more perceptive question than I had anticipated. There's a difference. Managing suggests awareness and control. Suppressing suggests effort that will eventually become unsustainable. His tone was neutral, clinical. The former is useful. The latter is a liability. I stared at him. He stared back. Managing, I said, after a moment. Definitely managing. The corner of his mouth moved. Just slightly. Just for a second. Good. He stood, which meant the interview was ending. I stood too. I'll have Miss Cho contact you with the terms by end of day, he said. If you agree to them, you can start Monday. I blinked. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Mason. He was already looking back at his tablet. The uniform is non-negotiable, he said, without looking up. In case you were going to ask, I hadn't been going to ask. But something about the way he said it, the fact that he said it at all, made me think he'd been expecting me to. And something about the fact that I wasn't bothered by it seemed to have, in some small and carefully unacknowledged way, mattered to him. I left the study, in the elevator going down, alone in the glass box with the city spread gray and rainy behind me. I pressed my back against the wall and let out the breath I'd been holding for 45 minutes. My heart was beating fast. Not with anxiety, with something else entirely. I told myself it was adrenaline. The terms were extraordinary, live-in accommodation in the penthouse's designated staff suite, which turned out to be larger than my current apartment. Full board. A salary that made me check the email 3 times to make sure I wasn't misreading the number. Monthly performance reviews. A detailed list of duties: household management, meal preparation, scheduling support, correspondence management when requested, all of it clear and precise, leaving nothing ambiguous. There was also a clause that read, "The employer acknowledges that the position requires close and sustained proximity to a strong alpha and confirms that no behavioral compliance will be required of the employee beyond standard professional conduct." The employee's biological designation does not inform the terms of employment in any way. I read that clause 4 times, then I signed. Moving in on Monday was surreal. I had one large duffel bag and a box of books, which Ms. Cho helped me carry to the staff suite with a completely straight face, as though this was entirely normal. The suite was at the east end of the penthouse, separated from the main living areas by a short corridor and a door with a lock on my side. "Mr. Mason begins work at 6 a.m., Ms. Cho told me. He prefers to have coffee prepared before he emerges from his home office. Black, no sugar, in a specific cup. You'll find the details in the household manual. He works through the morning without interruption. He takes lunch between 12:30 and 1, and prefers it be available but not presented unless he requests it. He is in meetings most afternoons. He does not typically require dinner service as he often works late, but if he is home, he will let you know. What time does he usually get home? Variable. Sometimes 9. Sometimes midnight. Sometimes not at all." She said this without inflection, and I wasn't sure if I was meant to find it concerning or simply practical. "And on the days he doesn't come home, you manage the household as normal and enjoy the quiet." Her expression didn't change, but I thought I saw something in her eyes that might have been tired humor. "He travels for work frequently. You will have significant periods of relatively undisturbed routine." I nodded. I looked at the household manual, which was 15 pages long and included a section on the preferred temperature of specific rooms at specific times of day. "He's very particular," I observed. "Yes, is there anything in here he's flexible about?" Ms. Cho considered this with apparent sincerity. "The orchid on the kitchen counter needs to be watered on Tuesdays and Fridays. He is not flexible about that. Everything else," she paused, "he is less flexible about than the orchid." I set the manual down. Understood. The first week was a careful dance of learning. Kenneth Mason was, as advertised, difficult to be around. Not unkind, he never said anything cruel, never raised his voice, never treated me with anything that could be characterized as disrespect. But he was present in a way that filled rooms. When he was working, the silence around him was charged. When he moved through the penthouse, the air seemed to move with him. I learned his rhythms. Coffee at 5:50, before he asked. The specific playlist for his morning work sessions, which I found in a labeled folder on the household tablet, classical piano pieces arranged in a specific order, and which I started each morning without being told. The preferred temperature of his office. 2 degrees cooler than the rest of the penthouse. The fact that he ate his lunch standing at the kitchen counter reading something on his phone, not sitting at the dining table, and that if I set the table he would move everything to the counter anyway. I stopped setting the table, he noticed. He didn't say anything. But on Wednesday of the first week, he came into the kitchen as I was cleaning up after lunch, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with his coffee cup, and he said, "You adjusted?" "Yes," I said, quickly. "I pay attention." He looked at me for a moment. Then he went back to his office. On Friday, there was a different coffee cup on the counter when I came in to prep in the morning. Smaller. White instead of black. With a note that said, in very precise handwriting, "Yours, if you want it." I stood there for a moment looking at the cup. Then I made his coffee, and mine, and I drank mine at the kitchen counter while the morning light came in gray and soft through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and something in my chest felt very still and very warm. The second week was harder. He came home at 11:30 on Tuesday, which I didn't expect. I was in the kitchen in my sleep clothes, loose trousers and an old shirt, making tea because I couldn't sleep, and I heard the front door and froze. He stopped when he saw me. I stopped when I saw him. He looked exhausted. The kind of exhausted that lives behind the eyes, not on the surface. His posture was still perfect, his expression still controlled, but there was something in the set of his jaw that spoke to a very long day carrying very heavy things. "Sorry," I said, my voice quiet. "I didn't know you'd be home." "I'll get out of your way, you don't have to." He set his bag down near the door and loosened his tie, the first time I'd seen him wear a tie, in a movement that was tired and automatic. He came into the kitchen and stood on the other side of the counter. "I made 2 cups of tea, I didn't ask. I just made them, the same kind I was making for myself, chamomile and honey. Quiet and warm." I slid one across the counter to him without comment. He looked at it. Then at me. Then he picked it up. We stood in the quiet kitchen at 11:30 at night and drank tea on opposite sides of the counter, and neither of us said anything for a long time. The city was spread out behind the windows in a carpet of lights, orange and white, and the distant red pulse of signals. "You don't ask questions," he said finally. "No," I agreed, "most people ask questions, most people need to fill silence," I said. "I don't." He looked at me. That measuring, careful look that I was beginning to catalogue, the one that meant he was noticing something, filing it somewhere, deciding what to do with it. "Good night, Mr. Mason," I said, taking my tea. I went back to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark and pressed my palm flat against my sternum, because my heart was doing something stupid and I needed it to stop. By the end of the first month, I knew the shape of him the way you know a piece of music you've listened to every day, the phrasing, the pauses, the moments where it builds towards something and then deliberately doesn't resolve. He was not cold. That was the thing that surprised me most. The penthouse was cold, the office was cold, the controlled precision of his life was cold, but Kenneth Mason himself, when you watched carefully, was something else entirely. He just kept it very contained, and very still, and very far from the surface. He brought books home and left them on the kitchen counter, which I learned to move to a neat stack near his armchair before he noticed. He had a chess set on the shelf in the study that had clearly been played recently, pieces mid-game, the board slightly dusty around the edges but the pieces themselves handled and clean. He listened to rain sounds on a small speaker in his bedroom when he finally slept, which I only knew because my room shared a wall. And on quiet nights I could hear it through the plaster like someone breathing slowly. He also had, it turned out, a very precise aversion to having his schedule disrupted. He had 3 regular morning calls that went on his calendar as blocks of time labeled meeting but which Miss Cho informed me were actually calls with his younger sister, who lived abroad. He took them in his office, which I always made sure to have quietly stocked with fresh coffee and water before they began, and on those days his presence in the apartment afterward felt different, slightly less compressed, as though something had been briefly allowed to expand. I didn't comment on this. I never commented on things I observed. It was part of the job, and it was also, I was slowly realizing, one of the few things I did that seemed to make him relax by increments so small they were almost invisible, almost, if you are still watching. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now let's see what happens next. The incident with the alpha visitor happened at the end of the 5th week. I was finishing the kitchen when the door buzzer sounded. Mr. Mason was in his office. Miss Cho handled external visitors, but she had left early that day for a personal appointment, and Mr. Mason had said to forward anything urgent to him. I checked the door screen. The man on the other side was tall, broad, clearly an alpha. I could infer it from something in his posture. The way he stood. He identified himself as Dorian Cole, business associate, and said he had an unscheduled visit. I should have simply buzzed Mr. Mason. I know that now. Instead, I opened the door. Dorian Cole walked in and immediately filled the space in a way that was aggressive rather than simply present. He looked at me the way some alphas look at omegas they don't know, assessing, a little too slow, a little too certain. "Cute uniform," he said. "Mr. Mason is in his office," I said, my voice even. "I'll let him know you're here, no need." He moved past me into the living area as though I hadn't spoken, as though doors and the people who answered them were simply obstacles the universe provided for his convenience. I was about to call through to the office when the study door opened and Kenneth was already there. He took in the room in a single glance, Dorian's position, my position, the particular quality of the air between us. His expression didn't change. But the pressure of his presence in the room shifted, immediately and completely, in a way that made every hair on my arm stand up. "Dorian," he said. His voice was perfectly level. "You're unscheduled, thought I'd drop in." Dorian smiled. He glanced back at me. "Nice addition to the household, Ken." "His name is Reuben," Kenneth said, in a tone that was still level and had somehow become extremely cold, "and he's my household manager. If you have business, come to my office." He stepped back and held the study door. Dorian's smile shifted slightly, like something that had been challenged and wasn't sure whether to push back. Then he went through the door. Kenneth's gaze moved to me, briefly, before he followed. Something in it was a question. I gave him a small nod. "I'm fine, it's fine," and he went in, and the study door closed. Dorian was gone within the hour. I didn't hear what was said. That evening, Kenneth came into the kitchen as I was finishing up. "Are you all right?" he said. He said it as a question, but there was no question mark in his delivery. It came out flat, careful, as though he was making himself ask rather than assume. "I'm fine," I said. It was nothing, it wasn't nothing. A pause. "I'll ensure future visitors are announced. I should have had a protocol in place already, Mr. Mason." I turned to face him. "I've dealt with alphas like that before. I can manage, I know you can manage." His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that had an edge. "That doesn't mean you should have to." I looked at him. He looked at me. The kitchen was quiet. The evening light was coming in warm and low through the windows, and in it he looked different than he did in the morning, less sharp-edged, less contained. The exhaustion was there again, behind his eyes. "Thank you," I said quietly. He gave a short nod and left the kitchen. I turned back to the counter and gripped the edge of it for a moment and told myself, very firmly, that whatever was happening in my chest was manageable, and professional, and absolutely not what it felt like. The 6th week brought a change. He started staying in the kitchen when I made dinner, not obviously. Not sitting down at the counter with a glass of wine and watching me work, nothing so transparent as that. He would come in for water, or to refill his coffee, or ostensibly to check something on his phone, and then he would stay. Leaning against the counter on the far side. Not in my way. Just, present. I didn't acknowledge it at first. Because I thought if I acknowledged it he would leave. I just talked, not much, not performance, just quiet observations. The recipe I was adapting. Something I'd read in the newspaper. Whether the orchid looked like it was getting enough light, he would respond. Sometimes briefly, 1 or 2 words. Sometimes more. He had opinions about the newspaper, strong ones, delivered in that low voice with that flat precision that I was learning to read as the shape of a personality that had been very carefully taught not to take up too much space and had spent years working out how to take up exactly the space it intended. "You grew up wealthy," I said one evening. I hadn't meant to say it. It just came out. A pause. "Why do you say that? You know how to be comfortable with staff but you don't know how to be comfortable with people." I focused on the cutting board. "Rich kids often get one or the other. Sometimes neither." A longer pause. "My father ran a company," he said. "My mother ran the household. Both of them were very good at management." His voice was neutral. "I was managed quite efficiently." I stopped cutting. I looked up at him. He was looking at the window, at the city lights, and his profile was very still. "I'm sorry," I said, quietly. Not performing sympathy. Just meaning it. He looked at me then, and the thing in his expression was something I hadn't seen before, unguarded. Just for a second. Raw and real and gone before I could fully look at it. "The chicken will burn," he said. I turned back to the stove. "It won't, it will, it won't, Mr. Mason." A pause. Then, very quietly, "Kenneth," I kept my eyes on the pan. "It won't, Kenneth." The silence that followed was warm. The first time I got sick, I was embarrassed about it. It was a mild cold, not serious, but it knocked me flat for a day. I woke up Thursday morning with a sore throat and a head full of cotton wool, made his coffee on autopilot, and then promptly had to sit down on the kitchen floor for a moment because the room had gone slightly sideways. Kenneth found me sitting on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet. Coffee cup carefully still held so it wouldn't spill, eyes closed. "Reuben, the coffee is ready," I said, without opening my eyes. "I just need a moment." "You're sitting on the floor." "I'm aware." I heard him cross the room. He crouched in front of me. I heard the quiet movement of it, and when I opened my eyes he was right there, close, and the full force of his presence at close range in a moment of personal vulnerability made every omega instinct I had sit up at sharp attention. I held very still. He pressed the back of his hand to my forehead. It was brief, clinical, cool. But it was present. Real. His attention fully and completely on me. "You have a fever," he said, "mild one. Go back to bed." "I'm fine, I can, Reuben." His voice was quiet but absolute. "Go back to bed." I went back to bed. I spent the day in my room, sleeping mostly, and tried not to think about the fact that a tray appeared outside my door at noon with soup and tea and a specific brand of honey that I hadn't had in the apartment before, which meant he had either had it delivered or gone to get it himself, and I was not going to think about which one. I was not. I heard him work all day, the quiet sounds of the penthouse, and when I woke in the evening there was fresh tea outside my door and a single book, one of the ones from his stack, with a note that said, "In case you need something to do." I pressed the book against my chest and lay there in the dark and felt something rearranging itself in me with very quiet, very certain determination. 2 months in, I understood the business. Kenneth ran a private equity firm, not the flashy, aggressive kind you read about in newspapers, but the careful, architectural kind that built companies from the inside out, restructured them, made them functional, and then stepped back. He was good at it the way he was good at everything, precisely, efficiently, without visible effort. He was also, I was slowly learning, under a pressure I hadn't initially registered. There was a hostile acquisition attempt on one of his portfolio companies. I learned this not because he told me, but because of the late nights, the calls that bled past midnight, the way his posture changed. Still perfect. Always perfect, but with a quality of load-bearing in it that wasn't usually there. I stopped asking if he needed anything. I just ensured things were there. Coffee at midnight when the calls ran long, food that could be eaten cold if he didn't get to it, the ambient noise in his office turned to something steady and low, the lights on a setting that wouldn't strain his eyes. Small adjustments. Invisible architecture, he noticed. He always noticed. "You've restructured the household routine," he said one morning, looking around the kitchen with that measuring gaze. "Is that a problem?" "No." A pause. "It's efficient. You've been working harder than usual." The routine needed to adapt. He looked at me. "You didn't ask, you would have said you were fine." A beat. The corner of his mouth moved. "I am fine, I know. But there's fine and there's supported, and both are available if you'd like them." Something moved across his face, that fast, unreadable thing that came and went before I could categorize it. "Supported," he said, as though testing the word. As though he wasn't sure he knew what it meant when applied to himself. "Yes," I said. He turned back to his coffee. But I was almost certain I saw, the tension in his shoulders drop by a fraction of a degree. The breaking point came on a Friday. I don't know what happened in his meetings that day. I know he came home at 4 instead of 7, which was unusual. I know he went straight to his office and closed the door. I know I heard, through the door, 2 minutes of absolute silence followed by the sound of something heavy being set down very carefully, which told me more than if he'd thrown it. I made tea. I stood outside the study door. I knocked. "What, tea?" I said. "That's all." A pause. Then, "Come in." He was sitting in the chair behind his desk, jacket off, both hands flat on the desk in front of him, staring at nothing. The room felt like the air before lightning. I set the tea down. I didn't say anything. I turned to go. "Reuben," I stopped. "Sit down." I sat in the chair across from him, the visitor's chair, the interview chair, where I had first sat and looked at him and understood without words that this was going to be complicated. He looked at me across the desk. His expression was doing the thing it did sometimes, that war between control and something beneath it, the two forces so evenly matched that you couldn't see the fighting, only the stillness that came from it. I don't know how to do this, he said. It was such a quiet, real thing to say that for a moment I didn't know what to do with it. Do what? I asked carefully. This. A gesture, brief, frustrated, entirely unlike his usual precision. Any of this. The company I built needs me to be something I'm not capable of being right now, and I don't. He stopped. His jaw tightened. I don't know what to do with that. I looked at him. Really looked at him, at the exhaustion and the weight and the careful, relentless competence that never permitted him to simply not know. Can I say something? I asked. That's generally what speech is for, Kenneth. I kept my voice gentle. You're allowed to not know. That's not failure. That's just being a person. A long silence. I don't find that particularly comforting, he said. I know. But it's true. I leaned forward slightly. You've been carrying this alone for weeks. You don't have to. He looked at me. The war in his expression was closer to the surface than I had ever seen it. You work for me, he said. Very quiet. Right now I'm just sitting here, I said. That's all. Another silence. Long and fragile and full of the sound of the city 42 floors below. The tea is going cold, he said finally. It is, I agreed. He picked up the cup. He drank. Some of the load-bearing quality in his posture eased, fractionally. We sat in the study for another hour. He talked, slowly, in his precise way, about the acquisition attempt, the politics of it, the calculation he was trying to work through. I listened. I asked one or two questions, when they seemed useful. I mostly just stayed. When I finally stood to leave, he said, quietly, without looking up from the desk, "Thank you, good night," I said, and went to the door. "Reuben," I stopped. "I don't," he paused. Something effortful in it. I'm not good at this. Being around people. Having people around. A beat. I want you to know that this isn't. I know, I said softly. He looked up at me then. And for the first time since I had walked into this penthouse, he looked at me without the careful managed distance. Without the professional remove. Just looked at me. Real and present and uncertain in a way that I thought he almost never let himself be. "Good night," I said again, gently, and left before either of us could say anything that we weren't ready for. The acquisition attempt resolved in week 9. I knew it had resolved because Kenneth came home at 6:30, which was early for him, and he came into the kitchen and said, "I thought I would cook tonight." I stared at him. "I am capable of cooking," he said, with a faint defensiveness that was, I was learning, his version of embarrassed. "I know," I said, stepping back from the counter with great care. "It's all yours." He cooked pasta. He was methodical about it, precise, the way he was precise about everything, reading the package instructions with his phone propped against the backsplash. It was not efficient. It was a little awkward. The pasta was slightly overcooked and the sauce was slightly underseasoned, and it was the best thing I had eaten in 9 weeks. I told him it was good. He said, "Don't patronize me." I said, "I'm not. The pasta is slightly overcooked but the balance of the sauce is actually quite good." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "The pasta was over by 30 seconds. I know, next time, 45 seconds earlier, yes." And he almost smiled. A real one, not the corner of the mouth thing, but something fuller and more honest, and gone almost before it arrived. I filed it carefully under things I was not going to examine too closely. The conversation happened on a Sunday. Sunday was the one day the penthouse breathed differently. No calls, no meetings, a slower quality to the morning light. I had established a Sunday routine: later coffee, a more elaborate breakfast, the windows cracked open if the weather allowed. Kenneth existed differently on Sundays. A little slower. A little less engineered. He found me on the couch reading, mid-morning, still in my own clothes. I wore the uniform for working hours and he had never asked me to wear it otherwise, another thing I catalogued as meaningful. He had his coffee. He stood in the living area for a moment in a way that was, for him, slightly uncertain. "May I sit?" he asked. I looked up, briefly surprised. It was his penthouse. His couch. Of course, he sat. Not at the far end, not as close as the middle either. A considered distance. He had his coffee and I had my book, and the morning light was doing something soft and golden through the windows, and neither of us said anything for a while. "I looked at your employment file," he said eventually. I tensed, slightly. "Is there something wrong with it?" "No." A pause. "Your previous position. The hospitality role." It ended with a note about a hostile work environment. I was quiet. "You don't have to tell me," he said. His voice was careful. It was an alpha employer. I said, after a moment. He wasn't. It wasn't violent or anything like that. He was just consistently, persistently certain that my designation meant I was available to him in ways that I wasn't. HR didn't take it seriously. I left. A silence. "I see." Kenneth's voice was level. Too level. "You should have been protected." "I know, the clause in your contract." "I read it," I said. For times, he was quiet for a moment. And I believed it," I said simply. "That's why I took the job." Something moved through his expression, something that felt like it had weight to it, like it mattered. "I want you to know," he said, slowly, "that the clause isn't. I didn't write it as a formality. I wrote it because it should always have been the default. The fact that it had to be written at all is." He stopped. Started again. "I've had previous staff who were omegas. I had been." Another stop. "I became aware that my presence was affecting them in ways they didn't know how to address. That's why I stopped hiring from agencies that didn't screen for compatibility. That's why the previous 4 candidates were released," I said quietly, "were offered polite conclusions and referrals to other positions better suited to them." He looked at me. "You are not afraid of me." "No," I said, "most people are, I know." I looked at him, at the careful precision of him in the Sunday morning light. "You're not scary, Kenneth. You're just, a lot. There's a difference." He was quiet for a long moment. "No one has ever made that distinction before." Then they weren't paying attention. A pause. Something in his expression was very still. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" he asked. And it was a genuine question, not rhetorical, not a test. Actually wanting to know. I thought about it honestly. "Because I can see when you're trying," I said. "And you're always trying. You try very hard to be careful with people. You're just not very good at making that visible." I looked down at my book. "It's visible to me." The silence that followed was very long. "Very warm, Reuben," he said. "Very quiet." "Yes, I am not good at this." His voice was precise but effortful. "I want to be clear about what I mean when I say that. I don't mean temporarily. I mean that I have spent most of my adult life making very deliberate choices about proximity and investment, and I don't know how to." "I know," I said. "I haven't finished." "I know," I said again, gently. "But you don't have to, beat." "I think I do." I looked up at him. He was looking at me with that full, unmanaged attention, the one that came out sometimes and that I had learned to simply hold rather than deflect. "I find myself," he said, very carefully, "functioning differently when you're present. And I am aware that this is not an appropriate thing to say to Kenneth." My voice was quiet. "Do you know what I find interesting about you?" He waited. "You decided I was off limits before you knew what I wanted." I closed my book. "You manage everyone's experience of you. You control every possible way you could be inconvenient or disruptive to someone else. But you never asked me if that was what I needed from you." He was very still. "What do you need from me?" he asked. The question was rough at the edges. Not his usual voice. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "But I'd like to find out." The first time he touched me intentionally, it was my hand. We were walking, he had suggested, carefully and with the slight awkwardness of someone who had rehearsed, a walk along the waterfront on a Saturday afternoon, both of us in ordinary clothes, no uniform, which felt like a door quietly opening. We had been walking for 20 minutes in mostly comfortable silence when he reached out and his fingers found mine, not grasping, just, present, his hand alongside mine, and when I didn't pull away his fingers closed gently around my hand. We walked for another hour, neither of us mentioned it. Neither of us had to. It was another 2 weeks before he kissed me, and it was not dramatic. We were standing in the kitchen after dinner, as we often did, talking about nothing in particular, and he had been standing close in the way he had started doing, gradually, incrementally, the calculated distance closing by degrees I suspected he tracked internally, and I turned to say something and he was right there and we both went still. He asked with his eyes before he asked in words. I had always liked that about him. He was always asking, underneath the control, underneath the precision, always making sure. Yes, I said quietly, to the question he hadn't asked aloud. He kissed me carefully. As though I was something he had thought about very precisely and wanted to get exactly right. I kissed him back, and pressed my hand flat against his chest over his heartbeat, and felt it moving faster than his expression ever let on. When we separated, his forehead came to rest against mine, and his eyes were closed, and he exhaled, long and slow, like someone setting down something heavy. I should mention, I said, quietly, that I quit. He opened his eyes. My employment position, I clarified. I'm not, if we're going to do this, I'm not doing it as your employee. I'll find another job. I can stay somewhere else while you don't have to go anywhere, he said. His voice was rougher than usual, and underneath the control there was something urgent in it. Stay. Just, not as my employee, if that's, he stopped. Started again. I don't want you to leave. I'm not leaving, I said. I'm just resigning from the specific position of person you pay to be here. Something crossed his face that was almost, a full smile. The real kind. Terms need to be renegotiated, he said. Yes, I agreed. What are your terms? I thought about it. His hands were still on my waist, warm and careful. Honesty, I said. That's the main one. I know you're not. I know this is new territory for you. I know it's going to be slow. I don't need it to be anything other than what it is. But I need to know what's real. I can do that. He said it immediately. Meaning it, and the orchid, I said. Someone still needs to water the orchid on Tuesdays and Fridays. He stared at me for a moment. Then the almost smile became the real one. Brief, honest, lighting up his face in a way that I thought might be the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and was almost certainly something he almost never let happen. I'll manage the orchid, he said. Deal, I said. 6 months later, and this is what I know. I know that Kenneth Mason wakes up at 5:40 every morning, a full 20 minutes before his alarm, and lies in the quiet and sorts through his thoughts with the same systematic precision he applies to everything else. I know this because now, sometimes, I am there for it, and sometimes he talks, quiet, unhurried, the day laid out before him like something he's considering rather than dreading. I know that his sister calls every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and that he is, on these calls, almost entirely different, easier, warmer. The control dropped in a way that it only otherwise drops with me. He has introduced me, over the phone, as Reuben, who is the reason I eat dinner before 9 p.m., and the squeal of delight from the other end of the line was audible from across the room. He pretended to be annoyed. He was not. I know that he still fills rooms with his presence, still charges the air simply by being in it. Still has a gravity that makes it impossible to ignore he's there. And I know that with me, he spends a little less time managing it, and I spend a little less time managing my response to it, and the space between us is no longer something carefully maintained but something quietly, steadily inhabited. I know that I am an omega who spent 3 years being managed and categorized and limited by what other people thought that meant, and who walked into a glass tower in the rain in a borrowed umbrella and a maid uniform and found something I wasn't looking for. I know that he, an alpha who had spent his whole life keeping people at precisely calibrated distances, let me close enough to notice the rain sounds he plays to sleep. And the chess game left mid-move, and the full smile he keeps like something precious. I know that love, when you haven't had much practice with it, is not a dramatic thing. It's a series of tiny adjustments. A cup left on the counter. A book outside a door. A hand found in the middle of a walk. I water the orchid on Tuesdays and Fridays. He has started cooking on Sundays. He is still slightly bad at it. I tell him when the pasta is overcooked. He tells me when I have let the sauce reduce too far. We are learning each other the way you learn something you intend to know for a very long time. The uniform still hangs in my wardrobe. I haven't needed it. But sometimes, very occasionally. On mornings when I am feeling particularly fond of the look on his face when he is trying not to react to something, I wear it anyway, and every single time, without fail, he looks at me with that deep water gaze and that still, precise face, and I watch him work very hard to seem unaffected, and I know that he is absolutely not, and I smile into the kitchen sink and do not say a word. I was desperate, once. Standing in the rain outside a glass tower with a broken umbrella and a borrowed uniform and enough money in my bank account to cover 2 of my 4 problems, I'm not desperate anymore. I am, instead, standing in a penthouse kitchen at 6 in the morning with the city spread gold and alive below me. Making coffee in the specific cup for the specific person who left a note that said yours, if you want it, and thinking that sometimes the most extraordinary things arrive dressed in the most ordinary circumstances. Sometimes they arrive in the rain. Sometimes they're wearing a Maid uniform. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Subscribe, drop a comment, and I'll see you in the next story.